sorry.
You did that bit before we did the Alice.
Oh, did I? Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and thank you so much for joining us today. So I do have a special guest on my channel today who has been on the channel before, but he's going to share some different insights with us today. And my friend has come all the way from Peru. No, it's not Paddington Bear. And if you saw my previous video, you probably know who this is. So if you want to see who this is, please keep on watching. And please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell if you want to hear when I release videos. Okay, so Chris, would you mind introducing yourself again in case anyone didn't see my first video?
Okay, my name's still Chris Binge. I haven't changed it, and I'm still the person who's been roaming around the school, roaming around the world for about 35 years in international education. I started out in an excellent school in Singapore, a United World College of Southeast Asia, and I learnt a lot there. I then moved to Geneva, the International School of Geneva, where I had my first headship. I was head of one of the schools within the foundation of the International School of Geneva, and we had about 1,200 kids. It was a secondary school. Very, very international, as the name goes. Certainly the most international I've ever worked in. I think we had 120 nationalities at the time that I was there. And it was a fascinating place to work. I then moved to Hong Kong, which is where I met you, Jenny, at the Island School.
Yes.
And that was my second headship. And what was interesting, having worked for, I'd been head, I think, 11 years in Geneva. And so I thought, well, what's it going to be like moving to Hong Kong, going to Island School? And on the surface, the two schools had a lot of similarities. They were both IB diploma schools, been doing IB diploma for a while. They had similar numbers. The Island School was a little bit bigger than the La Chataignerie Secondary School. They both did GCSEs, and they were both quite international given the market that they were in. So I thought, well, you know, the schools are going to be much the same. They'll do things in the same kind of way. They'll have the same kind of structures. They'll have the same kind of beliefs. What will be different will be the people. That'll be interesting. The staff, for example, will be a completely different group of people, and that's what it'll take to learn. I was completely wrong. It's exactly the opposite. The structures and the ways in which the schools ran were completely different. Everything from the length of the lessons, to the bells, to the length of the day, to the amount of time you spent learning each subject, to the way the exams were run, to the way graduation was done, to the induction of the new students. Everything was different. The staff, on the other hand, were absolutely the same. There was the same range of beliefs, of commitments, the same group of people who were frantically engaged in doing as much as they could with tremendous enthusiasm, the same group of naysayers who wanted school to be like it was 20 years ago because they hadn't moved on and everybody else had. And all of the attitudes that I saw in Geneva were repeated exactly by a different group of people in Hong Kong. Great staff, wonderful group of people in both cases, but the same beliefs and the same attitudes. Well, not the same beliefs, and that's the key point. The point is that they believed the way they did things in their school was the only way it could be done. My favourite example of this is school uniform.
Oh, your favourite topic, Chris, I know.
Because what I find wherever I work, in Geneva, for example, we had no school uniform. And the idea that a school could have a uniform was a complete anathema. How could you possibly have a liberal education when you insist on everybody wearing the same things? How can you possibly talk about learning people to be independent and free in the world when you don't even allow them to choose their clothes? At Island School, it was kind of mixed, but by the time I got to Peru, which was my third headship, the school was much more traditional, modelled on old British independent school lines. Uniform was part of their soul and has been part of their soul for 75 years. So once you start to talk to people about not having a uniform, they think you're mad. They think you're completely crazy. How can you possibly have a school where the kids aren't in uniform? They'll all go bananas. Everybody will be vying for the best fashions. I said, well, in Geneva that never happened. He says, it must have done. It's obvious. Evidence that it could be done a different way is completely irrelevant. The belief and the passion in an idea that really has no substance in either direction is what matters to these people. And the interesting thing about uniform, which is where I get a lot of my ideas about change management in schools, The interesting thing about uniform is that the research that has been done shows that there is no advantage in terms of learning. There is no advantage in having a uniform or not having a uniform. Research demonstrates that it doesn't make any difference in terms of learning or happiness of kids or the environment of the school whether you have a uniform or you don't have a uniform. There is really no evidence to indicate that one is better than the other, and that's been shown up in several different studies. What is interesting, though, is that if you take a school and change from one to the other, very often it has a positive effect. It doesn't matter whether you change from not having a uniform to have one, or from having a uniform to not having one. The attitude and the change in the way people work is improved. So I did some thinking about that. Why is that the case? And what it occurs to me, and we've tried this in a variety of different other ways, is that change is a positive influence because it forces people to rethink the relationships they have, rethink the things that they do, and rethink how they solve the problem. For many teachers who've been doing the same thing for many years, teaching to the same exam syllabus, teaching the same subject, the same length lessons, the same bells that ring, the same kids in the same uniform year after year, they've never been challenged to rethink it and say, really, what do I need to do to make it better or different? And they go through professional development. But if you put them in a changed situation, you change the structure, then they have to say, well, what do I do now? And they talk to each other about, how did you do that? You will remember, Jenny, when we introduced Island Time in Island School.
Yeah.
Island Time was a transdisciplinary course in a secondary school where the kids were taught for, I think, 4.5 hours. We had a bit longer than that.
Yes.
On one day, all through a day. And Jenny and I both taught Island Time at Island School. And for us, who'd been maths teachers for all of our lives, suddenly we were placed in a situation where we weren't the commanders of what we taught. We weren't the experts. The kids were becoming the experts faster than we were. They were telling us what they wanted to learn, and we had to sit with them and get them through 4.5 hours of doing that. My God, we had to change what we did. We had to change our structures. We had to change our pedagogy. And we had to think consistently, how do I do this? How do I rethink what I do to make sure that the relationship I have with the kid produces the best learning? And we used to sit at lunchtime and after school and talk about it and talk about it and talk about it. Some of the best conversations I've ever had about learning. And I was a better maths teacher for the same reason.
If I can just weigh in as well with what Chris is saying, because we both taught this 4.5 to 5 hour lesson, it really was a very clever way to help us actually rethink what does learning look like, because you couldn't stand at the front of the board for 5 hours because there's no way that the students would have been engaged. And so we really had to think about, okay, how can we actually plan these learning experiences that fully engage students, that they're learning, maximizing on learning and enhancing learning at the same time over a 5 hour period. And in my travels, I actually share the 5 hour lesson with a lot of different teachers, and they're shocked normally. But I think it's really good for helping us really think, what does learning look like?
So the answer, if you want to make teachers change their pedagogy and review their pedagogy, is you have to change structures. If you don't change structures, then they will go away to a wonderful workshop and hear a wonderful speaker and take in all these fabulous ideas, and they will go back, and for the first couple of weeks they'll change. For the next couple of weeks they'll change less. And then they'll gradually, because they're in a shoehorn of a structure that they have to return to, they will fall back to what they were doing before. So it's interesting, the structure. It doesn't matter what the structures are. I remember when we first introduced laptops, that changed the structure, and people had to rethink how they taught. Changing the length of lessons, as we've talked about. Doesn't matter what the structural change is, but if you've got great teachers who are committed about what they're doing, you've put them in a position where they have to think about it, and then everything that they do on the training makes sense, because they've got to use it. Otherwise they won't.
That I think that's such an important takeaway that I've just heard from Chris talk about. And he's given many, many examples of how you can actually change structure within the school. And even if you have the professional development, then at least if you have the structures in place, it's going to support the learning that happens in a professional learning environment. And I think a lot of schools now are recognizing that professional learning has to be ongoing, it's got to be sustained, it's got to be continuous. So we're moving away from this one and done model. And if the school is supportive in helping change structures to support the professional learning that's going on, then I think we've got a marriage made in heaven. So thank you so much, Chris. I'm going to be replaying this and listening to this because I know that there are a lot of words of wisdom in what you said, and you gave so many different examples. So thank you so much again, Chris, for joining us, and I hope that you'll be back on the channel when you're over again in Hong Kong. And thank you so much for watching as well, and I really hope to see you next time.
It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye.